Hello, Love Bay family. Welcome to Mental Health Hour. Like I always say, it's good to be here to spend this time with you. Um, the weather here is just yeah, it's getting to that winter that a lot of us dread. It hasn't started snowing yet, but it's dark, it's cold, it's icy, and yeah, we're just at this point a few weeks away from Christmas, those of us who celebrate Christmas, and from New Year's. I think most of us pay attention to a new year coming in. And we've been talking about triggers. Um, we have questions coming in, and I'm really glad that people are listening and people are learning and people are sharing and reflecting on their own mental health and their own experiences with trauma and triggers. Before I go any further, a reminder that Mental Health Hour with Dr. Tapo is for education and information. It does not replace treatment with a physician or therapist in your local area. So please, if you need help, if by listening to us you realize, okay, I need help, reach out, reach out to a professional close to you. This is for information and educational purposes only. And do get in touch with us. I have a few questions and comments from listeners. But before I go into that, if you want to get in touch, send us your messages, send us your questions, send us your stories, your experiences so we can share. It's 437-778-3299, 437-778-3299, or email infolovebay@gmail.com. So, like I said, we've been talking about triggers. We've been talking about triggers because the holidays are coming up, and a lot of people get triggered around the holidays by different things. Um, and it occurred to me that I need to give you a solid definition of trauma, because the triggers that we're talking about are related or connected to trauma. They're trauma triggers. I said it before that the word trigger has just been used so loosely lately that everybody's claiming they get triggered by this and triggered by that, and that's not the triggering we're talking about. Some of us just have bad attitudes, and everyone and everything triggers us. That is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is trigger related to a real trauma that you might have experienced. And trauma is the lasting emotional response that you experience over a period of time due to a distressing event. So, trauma is that lasting impact of a distressful event. It can be war, it can be sexual assault, it can be an abusive parent, it can be being hit by a car, it can be uh, being cheated on by a partner or spouse, being lied to. It can be so many things. I said before, because people have asked how many triggers are there, and I've said there are about as many triggers as there are human beings that have experienced trauma. There is no one standard trigger for survivors of rape and sexual assault. There is no one standard trigger for people who survived a burning building. It doesn't work that way. And I've said before that two people can experience the same event, but their trauma and their trigger can be quite distinct and different. So trauma, remember this, is that lasting. And that word lasting is really, really important, because sometimes something happens to us. Let's say you're in a car accident and immediately you're talking about trauma. And I'm not discounting that. And then 3 months down the line, you experience something else, a trigger, and it brings back those feelings that you had when you were behind that wheel in that car. 3 years down the line, it can be 13 years, it can be 30 years. Trauma has a lasting impact on our psychological, our emotional, our mental being. And triggers are those stimuli that bring that response back. So triggers bring us back to that moment of trauma. And I've said before, it can be almost anything, a noise, a place, a smell, a song, a voice. It can be almost anything, a color, anything that just on your mind brings back that emotional response to a trauma that you experienced or a distressing event that you experienced. So that's what trauma is. And the triggers we are talking about are connected to trauma. So again, if you're that type of person who gets offended by everything and you're going around talking about I'm easily triggered, you just have a bad attitude and probably should see a therapist about that. It might also be that you have a personality disorder, and we talked about those some time ago. Triggers, if you look at them clinically, are not things that you plan on. You don't say, I'm going to visit my grandmother and I'm going to get triggered. That is you planning to have a bad attitude at your grandma's house. That's not a trigger. You don't plan triggers. Triggers happen to you unexpectedly. But we've talked about the more you start to study like these instances of triggering, and you start to reflect and look into yourself and really take the time, like, but why did I get so upset when I was at the mall? And it feels like it just came out of nowhere. And it might be that you were triggered unconsciously. It's okay to go back once you're feeling more in control and better able. Go back to that place at the mall, spend some time there, look around, sniff the air. It might be, I don't know, a scent. It could be maybe a store brought something back. Triggers are not things that we plan. We don't plan them. They happen to us unexpectedly, and they bring us back to that moment of trauma. They bring back that emotional response to a trauma that could have happened in your childhood, could have happened last year, could have happened at any moment in your life, but that trauma has had a lasting impact on your emotional and mental health. That is trauma. And trauma is also not something that you plan to get. I'm going to go over there and fight with him and I'm going to be traumatized. Trauma doesn't work that way. You don't plan your trauma, you don't plan your triggers. If you go there and you get into a fight with your boyfriend and get upset and hurt because things were said and done, that was you intending to go get upset and hurt because things will be said and done. And I want to be really clear about this because, in my perspective, we have become a society that has mainstreamed everything. And a lot of really important things are losing their meaning and significance. And our mental health is one of those. So, to the extent that now, if you actually say to someone, I'm triggered, they're just thinking, like, oh, there's another one of those people. But you actually might be suffering at that moment. But because we have taken these clinical terms and weaponized them and used them irresponsibly, I'll tell you something. As a psychoanalyst, as a psychotherapist, I am very, very careful when I use certain words. I just don't. I've had situations where people will come and ask me a question, even about themselves. Hey, Dr. Tapo, so do you think I have bipolar? Do you think? And I say to them, like, no, we're not doing this. If you suspect you have bipolar, go to your physician because it's not something to be taken lightly. And I really, really want us, as we're talking about trauma and triggers, to be able to separate real trauma, real triggers from what has become trendy, what has become fodder for social media. You have a fight with your mom, and then next thing you're on TikTok, bawling your eyes out, talking about how traumatized and triggered you are. We need to stop playing with some of these things because they are creating barriers to real mental health and real treatment and responses that are actually needed, because everybody out there is talking about, I have anxiety, I have triggers, I have trauma, and we shouldn't be. We should not be. Sometimes when people come to me and talk about I have anxiety, I ask them, when were you diagnosed? Oh, about 5, 6 years ago. Okay. And when was the last time you went to see a physician or psychiatrist about that anxiety? Because we should not be throwing around terms and illnesses and making them meaningless in such a way that those of us who actually need help, who actually need intervention, are not being taken seriously because people have decided it's fashionable to have anxiety, it's fashionable to talk about my trauma and my triggers. That needs to stop. That needs to stop. Okay, that's my bit of a lecture on bad behaviors. So we did get a number of questions and comments, and I'm going to go through them and answer what I can today. And we'll continue with our topic on triggers. Okay, so what's really exciting about the questions this week is that I think, yeah, there's not a single one from Canada. And we have gone like all the way to Japan. A listener from Tokyo, Japan. I think this is the first time I've read a message from Japan. It's really, really exciting to think people all the way in Japan are listening as well. So we have Bismarck in Japan, and he or she, they are asking, your topic on triggers is welcome indeed. At first, I took triggers at face value. Kindly let me know some of the common triggers I should know about because I want to know and learn more. Well, there we go. Someone in Japan is listening and learning more about triggers. Okay, so common triggers, it depends on what we're talking about. So, like I said, there's no one size fits all to triggers. Just because you and I have both been in a car accident on Main Street does not mean we will have the exact same triggers. It doesn't work that way. However, there are some common triggers, especially when we start looking at relationships. Relationship triggers are common. And my theory around this is that as human beings, the way we socialize and are socialized almost in a way predetermines how we will relate to each other. That's this whole argument, for example, about gender, that gender is a social construct. No one is born male, no one is born female. It's how you're socialized and all of this. And I am not bringing this up to debate it. I'm bringing this up because There are common triggers, and what makes them common is the fact that we are socialized to behave and express ourselves in specific ways. So, relationship triggers are actually some of the easier ones to identify. Okay. And I want us to talk about relationship triggers specifically today because I brought this topic up because, yeah, the holidays are coming. We're going to be gathering with our loved ones and not so loved ones, and our frenemies and enemies, and our village people, and all of that, right? And a lot of us get triggered. Again, I'm not talking about the kind of trigger that as you're driving to your mother's house, you're already planning, as soon as that woman says something, I'm going to be triggered and I will react. That is not a trigger. That is you making a choice to react. Okay, you've already planned for it. You are coming fully armed and prepared to fight. So it doesn't matter if she even says the sky is blue, that will trigger you because that was your plan. That is not what we're talking about. Relationship triggers also come from an experience of trauma. So that is really, really important. Do not separate the triggers from the traumas, right? When we're clinically speaking, triggers are about trauma. They're not about who you hate, who you dislike, and what they said to you last year, and this year you're waiting, right? Again, that's you making a choice. That is not a trigger. That is you just waiting, hoping they will test you this year. That's not a trigger. Okay? So, relationship triggers are tied to some trauma in relationships. It can be parental relationships, it can be spousal relationships, it can be friendships, it can be like anyone that you relate to in a specific way. And through that relationship, you experience a distressful event. And it could be also a series of distressful events. So, for example, domestic violence. It might happen once, it might happen 100 times, but that violence will create an emotional response that may later on in future relationships or in other relationships be triggered and bring back that distress from being beaten in your relationship. So even if you've left the person, the fact that you experience this trauma at their hands, you can still be triggered. Okay? So relationship triggers are tied to trauma that comes about through relationship. It can be parent child, it can be grandchild, grandparent, it can be the neighbor next door that used to come for tea all the time, it can be Uncle Larry and the stuff he did to you. It can be your spouse, your ex girlfriend, your ex boyfriend. It could be your former best friend. It could be a high school teacher. It's about the relationship and the distressful event that comes through relationship. So we often think in terms of, I have to be really, really close to someone for them to hurt me enough to be traumatized. And that's not necessarily true. You could have a teacher that is abusive and you don't even know where they live. All you know is they're called Mrs. So and so, or Mr. So and so, or Sir this, or Madam that. But in your relationship with that teacher, some distressful event happens and you experience trauma. So it's not the depth necessarily of the relationship. It can be, if we're talking about intimacy and the betrayal of intimacy, like your spouse or your partner cheating on you, that can be a traumatic event. And that trauma can be because you were so intimate with this person, you were so close. The last thing you ever expected was for them to betray you in that way. And when you find out about that betrayal, you experience real and genuine trauma. Okay. So relationship triggers are tied to relationship trauma. Okay. So, what are some common relationship triggers? And I should say, triggers are emotional. Okay. That emotion that is tied to the trigger, and we've talked about emotions and feelings in the last couple of sessions. So I'll just kind of reiterate briefly, just to be clear. So, an emotional trigger is not something you plan. If you know you're going somewhere and you're going to get angry, that is not necessarily an emotional trigger. You knew it was going to happen. You walked right into it, and then it happened. You can't be talking about I was triggered. You planned that, you went there, you had that happen to you. And what we call that is a feeling. If you remember, I said emotions, like triggers, happen in a split second. You hear a joke, you laugh. You don't laugh for the next 24 hours. You laugh for that moment. Somebody says something mean to you, it hurts. What makes you hurt for the next 24 hours is the thought you now attach, right? Those negative thoughts that now keep running through your head. I can't believe he said that, he did that. And so 24 hours later, 24 days later, 24 months later, you're still upset. Those are called feelings. When you have an emotion and you attach thoughts to it and therefore prolong it, and you keep getting, not even getting, you stay in that position of upset because you're feeding the upset with your thoughts. Those are feelings. And we're differentiating feelings from emotions because emotions happen just like that. They're quick, they're momentary, and they pass quickly, right? So triggers are like that as well. A trigger will not last 24 hours being triggered by the same trigger. No, it's an instant, automatic response to stimuli. It's automatic, it's instant, it happens. And so we don't often know it's coming. We can't plan for it, we can't prevent it. And if you remember what I said last week, we have to develop an awareness, and I'll get into that a little more deeply, an awareness of, okay, so anytime I go to that specific store, I smell that, I'm going to get upset. This is different from, let me go to the store, smell it, and get upset. That's planned. What I'm talking about is it happens twice, three times. You start to read the situation, to learn from the pattern. And now you can say, I've identified a trigger because I went there, this happened. Second time, it happened again. Third time, it happened again. So now I know that's a trigger, right? Now, if you now know it's a trigger and you go for the fourth time, you are now planning your triggers, and we've gone past that. You are now manipulating your triggers. And there we this is why I'm saying maybe then you need to start thinking about personality disorders, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorders. There are quite a number of them, but those are three just off the top of my head. those people, those personality disorders are likely to be manipulating and crafting and curating triggers. And that's not what we're talking about. So if you know, maybe it's your roommate, your housemate, your neighbor, and you know they're the type of person who deliberately go to get triggered, it might not be trauma we're talking about, it might be a personality disorder. So maybe in a nice, kind, and compassionate way, suggest they go and see someone. Okay. So relationship triggers, some common ones. And I'm using the word common because, like I said, because we're social beings, we know if someone says, "How are you doing?" 99% of us will say fine, or I'm good, or not so good. We know how to respond to that. We teach little kids, if somebody says, "How are you?" And most little kids, you ask them, "How are you?" They'll say fine without thinking about it because they've been socialized that way. And so, because of that type of socialization, we start to have common triggers. We start to have common triggers, like relationship triggers. Okay. So, abandonment is an example of a common relationship trigger. Abandonment is when somebody you were attached to emotionally, could be a parent, abandons you, leaves you, and by leaving you, abandoning you, you experience trauma, right? So now you go through life being triggered by abandonment. So every time someone leaves you, it feels like that time when daddy left or mommy left. Anytime you feel somebody is going to leave you, you have that same emotional response you had when your parent left. So being abandoned becomes a trigger for you. Another example is rejection, and it works much the same way. Maybe it's someone that you really liked, and it could have been a kid on the playground, and you tried to be their friend, and they rejected you in such a horrible, violent way that now you're just triggered by any form of rejection. You apply for a job, and they say, "We regret to tell you," and you immediately feel traumatized or re-traumatized. That feeling you had on the playground when that little kid, and you were a little kid, rejected you. Now anytime anyone rejects you, you feel and experience that trauma all over again. Do you see what's happening here? It's something that might have happened to you in the past is triggered, and you start to feel like that thing is happening all over again. Okay. Criticism. Now, this is something that, especially with parents, I think we really need to be more, and I've spoken about this in the past. We need to be aware of what we're nurturing in our children. Criticism is a traumatizing thing for a lot of people. I've had, I've known spouses talk about all she does is criticize, or all he does is criticize. Because when you are attached to a person and you're looking to that person, and we've talked in the past about self-esteem and self-love and all of that, for children, particularly small children, no one is born with self-esteem. No one is born with self-love. It's something we nurture. Just like no one is born admiring somebody, but through relationship, through socialization, through nurturing, we learn to love ourselves. We develop a healthy self-esteem. And if you're a parent, that's one of your most important jobs. You can provide the nicest house with the softest sheets for your child to sleep in. They have all the toys they need in the world. But unless you are intentional about building their self esteem, they can be surrounded by all sorts of precious and expensive and fancy things and have really, really low self esteem because you, as a parent, focused on the providing material stuff, but you didn't focus on the emotional. And so a child needs their parent to help nurture their self esteem so that when they're old enough, they actually have self esteem. Self esteem doesn't start from within, it starts from without and is internalized. When you have a parent who cheers you on, compliments you, and all, the same way you can criticize a child to the point that they hate themselves, you can encourage a child to the point that they love themselves. Criticism is a trigger because some people grew up with parents that could just never, ever find something good to say about them. And so they grew up always feeling unwanted, unloved, less than, imperfect, and just plain useless. So now they're in a relationship, they're married, and good for them that they managed, in spite that harsh upbringing, they managed to end up in a marriage, in a relationship. But anytime their spouse says something that's mildly critical, and it might not be that the spouse is always criticizing them. But because they grew up with this trauma, a tiny little bit of feedback is received as criticism and they're triggered. And they're triggered. Now, what do you do in situations like that? Go for therapy. That's what you do. Infidelity, betrayal, another common trigger, abuse, loss. So if you lost a loved one, they died, and it was a distressful event and you didn't quite grieve properly and didn't get the help that you needed, anytime you lose something or someone, it feels the same. Now, not all loss is traumatizing. I want to be clear about this. Yes, you lose a loved one. That does not automatically mean you've been traumatized. The death of your parent, your spouse, your best friend, it can be sad, it can be painful, and you need to grieve, but it's not necessarily traumatizing. What makes death traumatizing sometimes it's that it was completely unexpected. Maybe it was violent. Maybe the person suffered so much. Or I have a friend who had to look after her elderly mother until the mother passed away. And she watched her mother deteriorate over several years. And it got to a point where she could not sleep because the mother could not be left unattended for even a second. And so the intensity of the care that her mother needed was distressful for her. She wasn't sleeping anymore. She was hardly eating. And I'm talking about the daughter, not the parent. She was practically sitting next to her mother night after night, wondering, is this the night? Is this the night? For several years. So for her, that was traumatic. And by the time the mother died, she had been living with trauma for a while. And it's not that she was relieved her mother had died, but the death of her mom was not necessarily what traumatized her. Rather, it was the caring for her mom because she needed so much care that in order for her to care for her mother, she had to lose sleep. She had to suffer herself. And a lot of us will go through some of these experiences caring for our loved ones, our elderly parents. I've known even parents of children with critical illnesses, disabilities, and they experience trauma by caring for a person. There's something we call vicarious trauma, and that is something that can be triggered. And vicarious trauma is when you experience trauma due to your proximity or relationship with somebody who has experienced trauma. So you end up experiencing it yourself. So maybe your partner is sexually assaulted. You may not have been the one who was sexually assaulted, but because of your relationship with your partner, you will experience vicarious trauma. So you are traumatized as well. And so you might develop triggers as well, even though it didn't happen to your body. In a way, it happened to you. So relationship triggers are tied to relationship trauma. And it's not all about abandonment, rejection, criticism, infidelity, abuse, loss. It can be, like I said, because someone you love, that you care about deeply, experiences something traumatizing. And so you become traumatized as well. Okay? So I hope that has answered your question, Bismarck in Japan. Emilio in Mexico City asked, good evening, Doc. Can triggers be prevented? So like I said, Emilio, not really, because they are not things that we can plan for. They are not things that we can prevent. So I don't want to use the word prevent. What can happen is you develop enough knowledge and awareness that you start being able to, I'll say, manage better. So that trigger is not as overwhelming as it was before. That trigger, like maybe before, if you're triggered, you're in bed for the next 2 or 3 days and just can't get up. But as you start to recognize and understand, okay, this is a trigger and it's tied to that trauma, and you're doing the work to heal and all of that, that trigger may not be as overwhelming. And over time, you might become desensitized to it, which means it's still a trigger, but you don't react the same way anymore. It's still a trigger, but you have done enough healing work and enough mindful work, because mindfulness, and mindfulness, for those of you who don't know, and we've talked about it, I think it's been a while now since we talked about it. Mindfulness is when your focus, your attention is intentionally on something, so that you're not doing things absent-mindedly. So you can drink a cup of tea mindfully. And what that means is you're taking the time to feel the heat of the tea, to taste the flavor of the tea. Even as you swallow it and it goes down, you are experiencing it mindfully. You're not drinking tea, watching TV, and before you know it, you look down and your cup is empty. That is the opposite of mindfulness. Okay. But through being mindful, you can start to heal, you can start to do the work around the trauma, because the work isn't the trigger. The work you need to do, it's not the trigger. The work you need to do is on the trauma, because trauma is that lasting impact that is triggered. So it's not the trigger you need to work on, it's the trauma. So can you prevent triggers? No. Can triggers go away? Yes. And it could be through desensitization. It could be because you're doing the work around healing from your trauma, so that you're not re traumatized and you're not traumatized anymore. or that trauma does not have that same overwhelming, distressful impact on you anymore. You might still feel sad, you might still feel a little something, but it doesn't cripple you like it used to. So you can't move, you can't do anything, and it takes a while for you to feel like yourself again. So we don't prevent triggers, but triggers are not forever if you do the work around the trauma. Okay. We have another question from, oh, we're in Pretoria, South Africa. Okay. And Sophie says, I am an ardent listener to your program on Tuesdays, and this is an important topic you have introduced on your show. My question, therefore, is what are some of the coping mechanisms for dealing with triggers? Okay. So, I'm going to, okay, so there's another question here from Kampala in Uganda. Moses says, could prioritizing my mental health help build resilience against potential triggers? Absolutely, Moses. I think I just answered that. And I will answer you some more as I'm responding to Sophie in South Africa. There is also another message from Abidjan, Ivory Coast, from Monique, who says a lack of reduced need for sleep, or a lack of or reduced sleep has occasionally triggered the symptoms of my bipolar disorder. In this situation, I quickly address any sleep disruptions, often with a medication adjusted in consultation with my doctor. But it doesn't seem to be working anymore. What should be my next move? Because too much medication is getting me flustered. Please. And Monique ends by saying, great show. Thank you, Monique, for that feedback. It's really welcome. Okay, so let me answer Sophia Moses, and then we'll come back to Monique. So what are coping mechanisms for triggers? So like I said, when you do the work, don't focus on the trigger, focus on the trauma. If you haven't figured out why am I being triggered? Where's this again? Like, I'll use that example again. You're walking through the mall, without thinking about it, maybe it's a song that's playing, it's Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas Is You. Next thing, you're feeling really, really low, really sad, you're crying, you go to your car, you drive home, you get into bed, and you're there for the next 2 days. You've been triggered. That song, Mariah Carey, triggered you, right? So how do you cope? You need to, like I said, figure out what is my trigger. You might not even realize that it was Mariah Carey singing All I Want for Christmas Is You that triggered you. You might not even realize it, because some of our triggers remain in our unconscious. And you're walking through the mall, you're not necessarily listening to the music, but it's there. And this is something that we need to understand about the way our unconscious works. Now, this is me being a psychoanalyst. The unconscious is a real thing. Not everything we think is thought through consciously. A lot of our relating is unconscious. Like I said, you ask a little kid, how are you? They'll say, fine, without thinking about it. That's the unconscious. It's those ways that we relate and think and do and feel without thinking about it. And that's why mindfulness is important when you're talking about triggers and trauma, because you're bringing things from the unconscious into consciousness where you have a little bit more control. Okay? So that self-awareness is really important. Be self-aware. Sometimes we feel like I've been unhappy for the last 2 weeks. That is actually an aware person who can tell that it's been 2 weeks. Some people can't even tell. You ask someone, when was the last time you laughed? And they can't tell you because they have no awareness around their emotions and their mental health and all of that. You're just going through life. You wake up in the morning, have your cup of coffee, you go to work, you gossip at the printer and do whatever. You come back home, repeat the cycle tomorrow, and you're not stopping to think, how am I mentally and emotionally? And you don't realize that this cycle is doing something to you. Again, that unconscious. And then one day, after repeating this pattern for 3.5 months, you crash. And you don't even know why you crashed because you've been repeating the same cycle without that self awareness that you need. I always encourage you, check in on yourself. Check in on yourself. Sometimes, like Sophie said, is it Sophie? No, Monique said, even not getting enough sleep can make you especially vulnerable to triggers because you're already exhausted and tired, your mind isn't rested, and then something happens. And maybe if you had been resting and sleeping enough and exercising and eating well and being self aware, that thing would not have hit as hard. But because you're already sleep deprived, you are vulnerable. So take care of your mental and physical health. That's really, really important. We spoke before about emotional regulation, which is that ability to control your feelings and emotions. Yes, he said this, but I'm not going to spiral out of control because somebody said something that I didn't like. So maybe they triggered you. And especially with relationship triggers, emotional regulation is really, really important because people will say and do things. And here's the thing, sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who trigger us the most. And sometimes they do it deliberately because they know you so well. They have identified your trigger and you have not. And they know. And kids, little kids, learn how to poke their parents. And what I mean by this is a little child, 3 years old, will look at the parent knowing if I say or do this thing, mom is going to get mad or she'll come and chase me or this will happen. And to them, it's a game, right? Just because people are grown doesn't mean they stop playing those games. Sometimes you are in relationships with people that have no problem being manipulative. Maybe they don't want to see you for the next couple of days, and they know if I trigger her, she'll be in bed for 2 days. Then I can go and do what I want. So they deliberately trigger you. These things do happen. We are human beings. Some of us are not as kind as others. Okay. So you yourself need to know your triggers because chances are people around you know your triggers, right? So you need that self awareness. You need that reflective piece. You need to be able to step back to regulate your emotions when things happen. And how you learn to do this, we have what we call grounding techniques. Now, grounding techniques are things you can do to bring you back to the present. Remember, a trigger brings you to the past trauma. If the trauma happened just now, you can't be talking about I was triggered. That's not a trigger. That's trauma that just happened. A trigger brings a past or historical trauma to your present. So if you learn to regulate your emotions, you develop that self awareness, you know if this happens, this this is how I will respond. So you can't prevent triggers, but you can learn, You can start learning how to use certain techniques, and we'll talk about those some more next week because I'm looking at our time. So, grounding techniques, muscle relaxation. I think it was last week or the week before where I said triggers can hit you physically. And like a panic attack or an anxiety attack, the more you fight it, the harder it is. Sometimes when you are having a panic attack, the best thing you can do is let it happen. Because the more you try and fight it and you're losing control, it makes things worse. But if you let it happen, I'm having a panic attack, you start breathing in, breathing out. You're not fighting it, you're grounding yourself. And you know that it will pass. A minute or two, I'll be fine. So let it go through my body. Sometimes it's the same way with triggers. So you need to learn what we call grounding techniques. You need deep breathing, muscle relaxation, so that on a physical level, your body is not trying to fight. Remember, I talked about fight, flight, or freeze. So whether you're feeling like running away, again, deep breathing, relaxation, grounding techniques, it brings you to a place where the response is not as intense. And over time, you don't become as overwhelmed by that trigger as before. So you need to mindfulness, listen to your body, be aware of your body. Is my heart pounding? Am I sweating? Am I shaking? Am I feeling dizzy? Like, is my head swimming? And as you start to feel these things, you're not fighting it. You're focusing instead, like, oh my goodness, I'm shaking. So you start deep breathing, and it will pass. Okay? So when that trigger happens, and this takes practice. And I'm not saying then go off and be triggered 20 million times so you can practice 20 million times. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying with time, especially now that you've identified your triggers, you know, every time my partner is traveling on business for 2 or 3 weeks, I will experience abandonment. I will experience this. It's a trigger for me when they travel. I start to panic. I start to negative thoughts. Will they come back? Will they come back? Right? When you start to become aware of your triggers, somebody does this and I seem to always react this way. Somebody does that and I keep reacting this way. You're noticing a pattern. So now you've identified your trigger, right? So now you've identified it on a physical level. Deep breathing, it works. Muscle relaxation, that works too. And other grounding techniques, which I'll go over next week. Okay. So when we talk about relationship triggers, so like the betrayal, the abandonment, the feelings of helplessness or loss of control, these things trigger that past trauma that you experienced in a relationship. And often what that means is you get stuck in this negative cycle. I think some time ago I talked about cognitive distortions, the ruminating, where you're churning things over and over and over and over and over and over again in your head until you are mentally and emotionally exhausted. Um, the distorted realities where you imagine things in such a way that now you can't remember, is this real? Is this not real? Where did this come from? And you're now reacting to something that your imagination has cooked up because you're in this cycle of negative thoughts. We talked about irrational thoughts. We talked about generalizations. We talked about a number, I think there were about 15 or 16 different cognitive distortions. And these are tied to your trauma. So your partner's going away on a business trip for 3 weeks. Your abandonment issues or trauma triggered. Before they even go, you've already started that negative thinking, distorted realities. They won't come back. They'll meet somebody there and I'll never see them again. They'll get into an accident while they're overseas and I won't be able to, and no one will let me know, and all of this. And you get in such a distressed state because when you were a child, your mom went away on a trip and never came back. So every time your partner needs to go on a trip, you go through that same distress. So now you know what your trigger is. The trigger there is your partner traveling. Does that mean you should break up or they should stop traveling? No. What that means is you have some work to do around the trauma of when your mom left and never came back. It's not the trigger that needs work, it's the trauma that needs work. Go and see a therapist. Get the help that you need. Okay? So Monique, I did speak about the importance of psychotherapy. Medication can do what it can do on a physiological level, but even our sleep, if you have had chronic insomnia, you've tried this drug to help you sleep and that, and like Monique, you're feeling like, you know what, I can't keep doing this. Go for therapy. What's keeping you awake? For a lot of us, it's those cognitive distortions. You're fine throughout the day. You're fine when you're watching TV because why? Your mind is distracted by 10 million things. But as soon as you get into bed, all those distractions are gone. The negative thoughts descend on you and you can't sleep. 4 hours, 5 hours later, and you can't shut your mind off. Go for therapy. Go for therapy. You can't keep dragging your mental health issues away. You have to learn the coping mechanisms. You have to learn how to manage those things. And then you also, if you're somebody who has been traumatized in the past and you have triggers, you have work to do around the trauma. Because once you address the trauma, the trigger itself, not as powerful anymore because you worked on the trauma. So identify your triggers, manage them, but go for therapy and do some work around the trauma. Do some work around the trauma. Okay, I think I've answered the questions that I can answer today. If you have questions, get in touch with us. If you have experiences you want to share, you can text or email 437-778-3299 or email infolovebay@gmail.com. So as the holidays are approaching and we're going to be meeting with our loved ones, some of whom will trigger us, let's be aware that if you know that Uncle Larry triggers you, it doesn't mean avoid him. It means relate with him a little more mindfully. Be aware of where he is. Be aware of your own body language. If you find you've been sitting in the chair and you're tense, maybe all your muscles are like just tense because Uncle Larry's in the room, you can stand up and go somewhere where you can, again, the deep breathing, some muscle relaxation, And then the next time, try the deep breathing and muscle relaxation while you're still in the same place. And before you know it, when Uncle Larry enters the room, you're not triggered so intensely anymore. You might still feel a little something because he's still the monster that he is, but it's not as overwhelming anymore. The reality is, and this is the unfortunate thing, and I've had a number of, I'm recalling a particular message from a young woman who I did some therapy with, and her thing was every year, she had to face her abuser because it was a family member. And every time she would get triggered, she would, this huge emotional explosion, she's crying, she's screaming, and all her family members, her mom, everyone is just looking at her like she's the bad one. Why every time you do this, you just like attention? And because they haven't experienced what she experienced, they don't quite understand. And what she needed to do was the work around what her uncle did to her, first of all, but also, how do I manage the trauma in that moment, the trigger that has brought this trauma into this moment, so that I'm not crying and screaming and shaking and fighting with everyone because I'm triggered. Okay, so grounding techniques, we'll look at those next week. Our time is up. It's always a pleasure to spend this mental health hour with listeners all over the globe. Mexico City, Japan, Pretoria, Abidjan, and Kampala. Thank you for writing in. Please send in your questions, send in your comments. And if there's other topics for the future that you would like me to cover, you can write in as well. And because we can't talk about triggers for eternity, right? At some point, we need to move on to other really important issues. So if you have questions around relationship trauma, relationship triggers, or other topics, please write in. Have a wonderful week. Let's care for each other with compassion, with kindness and forgiveness. And always remember to take care of yourselves too. Good night.